So now let's start understanding more about the SQL Server Data Tools interface, which is the tool we'll use to create analysis services databases. The SQL Server Data Tools interface has a workspace with many toolbars. This provides lots of functionality to work with, but it also takes some time to get comfortable because of all the options that are available. Menus will provide a second area to get most of your work done, and most menu choices have an equivalent toolbar button. There are regular and context-sensitive menus and toolbars. This means that they are active or inactive based on the objects that you are working with in the SQL Server Data Tools interfaces. Windows are located on the right, left, top, and bottom. These windows allow you to look at more than one item at a time. Again, it'll take some time to get used to using this environment. Windows can be hidden and stay available through a menu choice or a tab in the workspace. When you are working with your cubes, the design area is where you will create, modify, and delete dimension and measure objects. Each object type will have its own interface for editing, the Dimension Designer and the Cube Designer, as well as wizards. When you are opened in a designer, sometimes there are tabs and sub-tabs. You can also have multiple design areas open at one time. These work areas can be customized, and what you'll find over time and that you can easily work more comfortably is that you'll start moving these toolbars, windows, and menus around to make it more adequate for your design patterns. You'll develop with more ease as you customize your work area. In these work areas, it's usually started with a wizard, and the Dimension and Cube both have very user-friendly wizards. But usually the wizards do not complete all of your work. You have to go to the designer to make sure you have finished everything the user requires. So now let's talk about developing a multi-dimensional cube in SQL Server Data Tools. There are some options available for creating a multi-dimensional cube initially. First, you can create an empty cube. That's right, you just walk through a wizard and it creates an empty cube. No dimensions, no measures, no attributes or hierarchies, just a cube to work with in the future. Next, if you don't have a data source already created to build your cube, you can pick an option to create the data source tables from a predefined template in Analysis Services. Analysis Services provides two template types: the Enterprise or Standard version of the AdventureWorks Data Warehouse relational database. This option is very helpful when modeling a data warehouse, especially the ones that we talked about in the previous section. Having a practice database created from this template is a great resource provided by Analysis Services. The last option we're going to discuss here is being able to create the data source tables from scratch. Here you will provide the measure and dimensions needed for the cube. Let's go to SQL Server Data Tools. So let's start building an analysis services database in SQL Server Data Tools. First, we will need to launch the SQL Server Data Tools development environment. If we go to the Start button and start typing SQL Server Data, we'll see the Visual Studio 2013 version of SQL Server Data Tools. We'll either hit Enter or double-click, and we'll launch the environment. Here we have the window for Solution Explorer in our upper right, and because we don't have a project created yet, there is nothing to work with in that window. In order to create a new project, we're going to go to the File menu choice, click the submenu New, and go to the submenu Project. If you notice in the upper left, there's a set of templates to create projects with. The first one is Business Intelligence, which is where we're going to be working. In the Business Intelligence Template folder, you will see Analysis Services, Integration Services, and Reporting Service. This training session is just concerned with Analysis Services. The first option in the Analysis Services template is Analysis Services Multidimensional and Data Mining Project. I'm going to make the window a little bit larger so we can see the full descriptions. The Analysis Services Multidimensional and Data Mining Project is what we're going to use to create a multidimensional cube throughout this section. The next option is to import from server, multidimensional and data mining. What this enables the user to do is import or reverse engineer a previously created multidimensional cube. This helps a lot for when you lose the code for some part of development, test, or production, and another user or yourself can actually reverse engineer the whole project. The cube, dimension, and all objects will be created in a new project. The next option is Analysis Services Tabular Project. This was added in SQL Server 2012 and is available in 2014. This is the creation from the Power Pivot option of Excel, which is the next section. Import from Power Pivot enables you to import from a previously created Power Pivot model in Excel to an Analysis Services Tabular project. This enables someone to prototype a type of tabular module in Excel and then import it into the Enterprise Edition of SQL Server to be shared by other users. The last option is Import from Server, Tabular. This is like the second option, except it's for a tabular model that has already been deployed. We're going to be using the Analysis Services Multidimensional and Data Mining Project, so please be sure that this option is checked, and let's go to the bottom of this window. The first thing we'll see is the name of this project, and we're going to change it to Empty Cube because basically we're creating an empty cube. In the far right, you'll see a button called Browse where you can change the location. We'll keep this location for now. The next is a checkbox to create a directory for this solution. This is a good option when you need to move the entire project to another location. Lastly, you'll see Add to Source Control. This enables you to use something like Team Foundation Server for a source control object. This helps you check in different versions as you develop over time. Also, it enables other people that are connected to the source control to extract the same code and work on the project themselves. We'll leave that unchecked and click OK. Now we have a new project and solution created in our Solution Explorer. You will see different folders under the Empty Cube project. The first folder, Data Sources, is where you create connection strings to your relational database or other sources. Once you have a data source created, then you create a data source view. That is where you show the tables that are related to each other. The two that we're going to be working with currently are going to be cubes and dimensions. This is where you create the dimensions that are then related to facts in a cube. So let's create a new cube. Right-click the Cube folder and select New Cube. The Cube wizard appears and you're going to click Next on the welcome screen. You're given some options to create a new cube. If you notice, the first option, Use Existing Tables, is disabled. The reason that is disabled is because there is no data source or data source view to create from an existing table. The next option is Create an Empty Table, which is the first thing we're going to look at. The third option is generating the tables in the data source from either no template or a predefined template. We'll leave Create Empty Cube selected and click Next. Because there is no data source view, our only option here is select on the data source view screen is None. We'll click Next here. Next, we're given a prompt for a cube name. We're going to call this empty cube because it is exactly that, an empty cube. Once we do that, we're given a screen, which is our cube designer. And of course, all you have here is an empty cube. There are no measures under the measures area, but you're able to create new measures and new measure groups. Towards the bottom left is the dimension area, and because the cube's empty, there are no dimensions. But we have the option of adding cube dimensions if we like. This is just a good example of the designer that you can view before creating anything further. We're going to close the empty cube, and we're going to right-click it under the cubes folder, and we're going to delete it. We don't need this empty cube. We just use it to look at an example of the cube designer. Our next option will be able to create a cube based on a template. This also gives us an option to create the data source and to create the underlying tables in a relational database. The first thing we'll do is right-click Cube and select Create a New Cube. This time we'll click Next in the Welcome screen and then check the radio button, Generate Tables in the data source. We're going to roll down the templates and look at what's available. Here we have an Enterprise Edition of the VentureWorks database as well as a Standard Edition. We're going to select the Enterprise Edition because that's the edition we're working with, and then click Next. Here we get the Define New Measures. First, I'm going to make the window a little bit larger so we can see everything. Because of the template, we have a select set of measures that were within the VentureWorks database. In the first column, you'll see the measure names, and we have the options to check or uncheck any of these measures. You also have a column for measure group, which helps group or organize the measures. There's a data type and an aggregation type that will be used for those particular measures. In the bottom part of this screen, you'll see that you can add new measures if the ones from the template does not satisfy your needs. We won't uncheck anything or add any new measures and click Next. The Define New Dimensions screen will show the available dimensions from the template in the VentureWorks Data Warehouse database. The bottom of this window again is for manually adding new dimensions. There's an option for slowly changing dimension called SCD, and it's a column in your Select Dimensions from template. This option adds the additional columns to the dimension for tracking when certain values change in the dimension table. We learned about slowly changing dimensions in the Data Warehouse Design area of this training. Slowly changing dimensions are used for, say, when a list price changes for a product, and the business requires us to track that change in the database. Let's not check that option for now. It is beyond the scope of this session, and click Next. Here, we're prompted in the wizard for the time period for our date dimension. You can actually create a start and end date for your date dimension. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the year to 2010. Next, we're going to want the year, quarter, and month inside of our date dimension. The date column is the actual date. There's also an option on the bottom to change the language for the time members. We're going to stick to English. Next, we'll click Next. The Specify Additional Columns calendars gives you the option for creating different type of calendars. The regular calendar is what we're going to just call the calendar dates. The next one is for a fiscal calendar. If your business has a different start for the fiscal year, you can actually place that in here, and it'll be a separate set of columns in addition to the calendar year, month, and quarter for the fiscal year, quarter, and month. We'll check that option and click Next. The defined dimension usage is really the biggest requirement for a cube. Here is where you relate a dimension to a measure. and is where you specify the type of relationship between the dimension and measure or fact table. We'll leave everything to the default and click Next. Lastly, we need to give it a cube name, and we're going to call it AdventureWorks EE for Enterprise Edition. There's a checkbox in the lower left for Generate Schema now, and we will not check that, but do that in the next demo. Click the Finish button. Now we have a cube along with the related dimensions. There's a red squiggly line next to these measures because they are not linked to a table at this time. In the next step, we'll see how we can generate the schema so we don't have that error. Before we create our next cube, we're going to have to create a new database in order to generate the scripts for the tables. We'll minimize Visual Studio, go to the Start button, and launch SQL Server Management Studio. We'll start typing that in the search, click Management Studio, and it'll launch Management Studio for us. We're going to right-click Databases and create a new database. We'll give the new database a name. Keep the defaults for logical name, file group, initial size, and order group, and click the OK button or hit Enter. Here we will see that the AdventureWorks manual database does not have any tables associated with it for right now. We're going to generate the scripts to create those tables. Let's minimize Management Studio and bring Visual Studio back up. We're going to right-click Cubes and create a new cube. At the Welcome screen, we'll click Next, and then we'll check the radio button, Generate Tables in the data source. But this time we'll not select a template because we're going to manually create our measures and our dimensions. We'll click the Next button, and we're prompted for new measures. Before we type the new measures, I'm going to move the window to the left and make it a little larger. We can view things a little bit easier this way. In the measures names, I'll first create Internet Sales Amount and place it in the Internet Sales Measure group. This is of a currency type and is a sum aggregation. Next, we'll have Internet Order Quantity. And it belongs in our Internet Sales Measure group, is of an integer type, and is a sum aggregation. The next two measures are for reseller, and it includes Sales Amount, which is in the Reseller Sales Measure group. It's of a currency type and is a sum aggregation. Last, we'll just copy Internet Order Quantity and change Internet to Reseller Order Quantity. And this belongs in our Reseller Sales Measure group. It is of an integer type, and we'll click the Next button. Here, it's going to review the existing dimensions that can be shared across measures. We're not going to select any of these for now because we're going to manually create our dimensions. Click the Next button, and we have the Define New Dimension window. We'll change the time name to dim date to create a date dimension. In the bottom part of the window, in Add New Dimensions, we'll create dim product and make it a slowly changing type 2. It'll add the additional columns, and we'll go to the next row for dim customer, which is not a slowly changing, dim reseller, which is not a slowly changing, and dim sales territory, which is not a slowly changing. We'll click the Next button, and we're given the prompt to define the time periods for the date dimension. Again, we're going to change our year for the first calendar day to 2010, and then we're going to add for time periods year, quarter, and month. This will add those additional hierarchies we need for the date dimension. We'll keep English for the language and click Next. We won't add the fiscal calendar to this dimension. We'll just keep the regular calendar and click Next. In the defined dimension usage, this is like the attribute matrix that lets us relate measures to dimension attributes. Here, for internet sales, we have a relationship to date, product, customer, and sales territory, but we do not have a relationship to the reseller dimension. For the reseller sales, we have date, product, reseller, and sales territory, but do not have a relationship to customer. This is the difference between conformed dimensions and not conformed dimensions. We'll click the Next button. In the prompt for the new cube name, we'll call this a VentureWorks Manual, and in the lower left, we're going to check this box that says Generate Schema Now. This will actually connect to our new database and generate the tables and their relationships. We'll click the Finish button, and we'll get a prompt for a Schema Generation Wizard. We'll click Next on the Welcome screen, and what we have to do is create a new data source. In order to create the new data source view, we're going to click this button, New for Data Source. We get another wizard to create a connection string. We'll click Next. The new button under Data Connection Properties will prompt us for a server name, which is our local host, and then we select the database that we just created. In this case, it's a VentureWorks Manual. We can click the test connection just to make sure we can successfully connect as a Windows authentication. We can, so we'll click OK and then OK again. Now that data connection is highlighted in the first list. We'll click Next. We'll use the service account. This is very important in analysis services databases. If you have a service account for your SQL Server database engine, as well as one for your analysis services engine, these will be able to communicate more easily if they're an Active Directory account with permissions on both sides. Otherwise, you have to specify name and passwords, and no one likes to do that in development. We'll click Use Service Account and then click Next. It'll ask us for a data source name. We'll take the default and click Finish. It'll bring us back with that data source selected now in our Schema Generation Wizard. We'll click Next, and it'll ask us what objects we want to create and do we want to populate the time. We'll let everything default, click Next, and it'll actually give us some more attributes to change. We'll keep the defaults, click Next. It summarizes what we're going to do, and we're going to click the Finish button. Now, the Schema Generation Wizard will actually generate the Create Table and also the relationships through foreign keys between the tables we have specified. We're actually going to get a relational database that has the tables for our facts and dimension tables. Not only that, it will actually create the date dimension for us and populate it with the times that we specified in the wizard. After it finishes this, we're going to go into SQL Server Management Studio in order to view what was created. It's still progressing along, so what we'll do is go to SQL Server Management Studio, which is just minimized in our Task Manager. Here, if we right-click Tables and click Refresh, we should get a list of those tables that were created. If not, the wizard still might be processing. In our case, it looks to be finished, and we can see the date and other dimensions that were created, as well as the fact tables that were created. I'm going to right-click on the Dim Date table and say Select Top 1000 Rows. This will actually show us the rows that were created for our time dimension, which is pretty good if you don't already have a dimension date. Let's minimize Management Studio, and we'll see that our progress is finished for our Schema Generation Wizard. We're going to click Close, and now we'll see our new manually created VentureWorks cube, and we will not see the error messages that we had from the previous cube. This shows us that the data source view was created. It's called Empty Cube. If we double click that, right-click in the work area and zoom to fit, we'll see all the tables that were created inside of this cube and the other cube and their relationships. Before ending the discussion on data modeling for a data warehouse, we have to talk about an important part of this whole process, and that is maintaining data. Usually this is maintained in ETL, or extraction, transform, and load. In the SQL Server environment, this is usually handled by integration services, or SSAS. The whole point of ETL is to cleanse the data. In a dimensional model, you want clean data and nothing missing. ETL is where the transform takes place that cleanses data. We also have data validation. This is to make sure that the relationships between the dimensions and the fact tables are good. An analysis services database that doesn't have these things properly set up in the data will return errors, and the developer of the cube will spend more time figuring out the areas than could have been done in the ETL process. Integration services is SQL Server's tool to handle maintaining data through ETL. Slowly changing dimensions are also handled in SQL Server integration services. There's actually a wizard for the component for slowly changing dimensions. Most developers over time create their own slowly changing dimension data flows, but if you've never done this before, that wizard is very helpful. Updating the facts is one of the last things done in ETL. After you've cleansed the data, validated, make sure you had slowly changing dimensions created, then those surrogate keys from the dimensions can be looked up in the fact population and in that data flow, as well as any degenerate dimension or measures that need to be in our fact tables. The main thing you're doing when you're updating the fact is looking up these surrogate keys during the ETL process.